Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to talk at your seminar series. For those who don't know me, I'm a postdoc with the Tephra Research Group in Oxford. And as Adrian said, the talk's going to focus very much on Lake Suigetsu, which is a Varves sequence in central Japan. And I'm going to be talking about our lab's work on the core and some of my PhD results. And kind of as I'll touch on, work's still ongoing in different time periods of the core, as well as kind of now being in a stage to use the tephras for different in different fields of quaternary research and hazard assessment. So and really this has only been possible because of the really high resolution sequence offered by Suigetsu and also the underpinning chronology from the Varves and the radiocarbon dating as well. So as well as kind of reconstructing the past environments, past eruptive histories, I think I also wanted to kind of bring in that it's also very critical for understanding the behavior of some of these volcanic centers in Japan. And I included a picture here of Sakurajima erupting at the weekend behind a football game of Kagoshima. So yeah, understanding the eruptive histories of these centres is a very contemporary and relevant issue for today. And this centre as well was produced one of the largest eruptions, a VEI-7 eruption, which produced the AT tephra, which has completely blanketed Japan around 30,000 years. And I'll kind of touch on that a few times through the talk. So I thought that was a very interesting picture to crop up this week. Yes, I've included two photos here of some of the Suigetsu project members, past and present, and some people are missing from here as well. But these have all been critical work establishing Suigetsu as one of kind of now a renowned climate archive. And I'll just point out Takeshi Nakagawa, who has led the recent coring campaigns and kind of spearheaded research through kind of the recent work. And also you can see Akim and Gordon as well there, who have been instrumental to kind of building the Varve chronology, which I'll talk about. And also Richard Staff, who did the bulk of the radiocarbon dating that all kind of goes into this mega Bayesian age model, which I'll touch on. And then I'll also introduce the Tephra team. So in Oxford, that's led by Vicky Smith, and also Paul as a postdoc, and he's now based at Swansea. And there's also Sophie Weinberg as well, who's a PhD student working on the tephras in the core. And I think these photos are also quite useful to show how significant and marked the seasonality is at Suigetsu, which obviously helps the differential deposition and formation of the Varves themselves. So yeah, rainfall is mainly in the form of snow, as you can see on this picture here in the winter. So I'm going to split the talk into three sections. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Suigetsu and a bit of an introduction to the lake itself, the setting, and kind of signpost some of the key papers if you want to look further into these. And then I'll move on to talking about the rationale behind why we're so interested in the volcanic ash sequence in the core, as well as some of the context into the volcanic backdrop and methodology we're using. And then finally, I'll just use a few case studies of some of the key tephras and examples of where we can take this research, trying not to get too bogged down in the granular details, because there are many tephras that I could talk about for a long time. So just to orientate you, here's a regional map of Japan, and you can see that Suigetsu is positioned right in the central part on Honshu, quite near the coast, actually, north of Kyoto and Lake Biwa. And it's in Fukui Prefecture. So it's a tectonic lake, and it's part of a 5-lake system, and they sit on the western side of the Makata fault line. And the lake is about 34 meters deep, about 4 kilometers squared. And it has a really unique hydrological setting, and this is partly because the main inflow to the lake comes from the Hasu River, which is here, and the water supply goes through Lake Mikata and then filters through a small channel in here into Lake Suigetsu. Yeah, the channel is about 40 meters across. And that means that only, really fine sediments actually make it and are deposited in Lake Suigetsu itself. And you can see that from the cores that are taken from Mikata for comparison. Also, the lake's really sheltered. So you can kind of make out here, there's a ring of hills that surround the lake, and they're about 400 meters in elevation. And this has kind of also really protected the lake from storms and earthquakes, and protecting the sediment below. So there's been a very long history of active research on the Suigetsu sediments, over 3 decades. And the very first cores were taken the month I was born in 1991. But the first long sediment sequence was in 93, which showed that the sequence was annually laminated between 12 meters to 46 meters, so roughly 10 to 60,000 years. And this core was used to generate over 300 radiocarbon dates, to kind of, with the idea that it would be integrated into the radiocarbon calibration curve. But kind of a statistical analysis of these dates showed that there was kind of a divergence caused by missing sections, missing varves, which was caused actually by just the drilling technique, which used a single kind of borehole, which disturbed sediments. So the lake was then cored again for the SG06 core, which uses 4 parallel boreholes to kind of create what we now know is kind of the optimal way to kind of ensure that your cores are completely intact, and you can make good assessments of the integrity of your core across these. So yeah, 4 boreholes from SG06. And if you if you want to know more about that process, it's all in Takeshi's paper here, 2012 paper. And then in 2014, the lake was cored for the most recent time, and this also used 4 additional boreholes. And the main objective of this was to create thin sections to be displayed at the purpose-built museum on the lake shores of Mikata. So you can see a picture here of the backlit thin sections, which are really, really beautiful. And yeah. And so we also have material that we've worked on alongside the SG14 coring campaign. Okay, so the varves are obviously of paramount importance to the significance of the Lake Suigetsu sediments, and they're present through much of the sedimentary profile, sometimes clearly visible, sometimes not. And they are composed of alternating layers of diatom-rich and siderite deposited after the lake overturn in autumn. And the siderite is very distinct optically when viewed in thin section. And I'll show you some images here from Gordon's 2012 paper, in plain light and polarized light. That's kind of like the most distinctive layer occurring, but he does mention that that's most frequently observed, but some of the other layers, kind of typical layers, are difficult to identify. So this led to kind of a combined complementary method to kind of build up the Varve chronology, so using the thin sections and the high resolution XRF core scanning, and where there were not clearly visible varves, and to check kind of the distributions of the layers, Gordon also created this algorithm, and that's all included in that paper as well, to kind of extrapolate between possible counts and check the integrity as well. So to kind of sum up the chronology, this is all built into a mega Bayesian age model in combination with the radiocarbon dates. So there's over 800 radiocarbon dates now within this model, spanning over 50,000 years. And yeah, this has generated a really, really precise sediment record that we can use to kind of interrogate the paleoenvironmental record and the tephra sequence as well. So yeah, I don't have a huge amount of time to go into the paleoenvironmental proxies and the work that's been done on this already. And so there's a few papers there to flag if you're interested. But of course, one of the most it has a really beautiful and high resolution pollen record through the sequence. And this allows us, with the chronology, to actually compare to other really high resolution records around the globe and compare onsets and offsets with, other paleoclimatic records. So within the core sequence, we have about 38 visible tephra layers preserved within the cores. And these range in thicknesses from 1 millimeter, so barely visible, all the way up to over 30 centimeters thick. And that's the AT tephra that I mentioned on the first slide. And they provide a really detailed record of volcanism from Japan and also South Korea. So the volcanic ash, as we know from the Lake Suigetsu record, can be dispersed thousands of kilometers away from its source, and can be deposited in a whole range of sedimentary records across its kind of dispersal footprint. So these can be terrestrial, lacustrine, glacial environments, or archaeological sites. And where we find these layers across these sites, we can use them to precisely correlate the records together without any chronological imprecision at all. And also, if we know the age of the eruption, we can then import that into other sequences to improve the age model. And in the distal realm, slightly further away from the volcano, these tephra layers are comprised of glass, as you can see here, and they can be very small particles, particularly if you're looking at non-visible ash layers like cryptotephra. These can be range, 15 to 20, 30 microns. So in a volcanically active region, if we want to use layers as time stratigraphic markers, we have a lot of work to do to get there before we can do that. So we need to really nail down the timing of the different events because of the sheer volume of them. And we have a lot of work to build up the geochemical compositions, not only for all the different sources, but also to establish how that composition changes through time. And this is really key to ensuring that we don't miscorrelate events, which is very easily done and kind of frequently recognized the more work we do in the area of even really large caldera forming events being miscorrelated, particularly in the marine realm. So yeah, distal archives are really key for building up eruptive records, because in the proximal realm, like you can see in some of these pictures, the outcrops can be really complex, and the activity of later events can completely destroy or even bury evidence of even large eruptions. And also it's quite difficult because of how frequently these centres are erupting for soils to develop. So it's difficult to date some of these. And actually, just to flag that subduction and arc settings are home to some of the very largest eruptions that we know of in the Quaternary and likely to be a source of the next kind of big eruption. And so key to kind of anticipating these events is really it's essential to kind of refine their geological histories as well. And this paper was quite interesting, kind of collates all of the large eruptions over the last 10,000 years. And 17 of these will come from centres in East Asia and Japan. But what I also wanted to highlight is that there are also, it's very important to kind of constrain even some of these medium-sized eruption events, so VEI 4 and 5, because we see that these also have the potential, even several thousand kilometers away, to have a big impact. And actually, a study by Kiyotsugi et al. Showed that there was a significant underreporting of VEI 4 and 5 events, like you would expect. So they looked at the Japanese LAMIV database and statistically showed that they think around 90% of VEI 4 events are yet to be reported at around the 100,000 year mark. So I think that's really considerable, like a huge shock to me. So across Japan, there are over 130 volcanic centers distributed across the islands, which have been active over the late Pleistocene and Holocene. And these centers are clustered along the main subduction arcs, like in the Kuro arc up here, in the north in Hokkaido, and the Izubonu arc down here. Some of the most explosive activity and kind of most relevant in terms of the dominant wind direction to Lake Suigetsu are those in Kyushu, like I mentioned, Ira, Kikai, Aso, some of the really large caldera forming events that kind of you see routinely blanketing Japan. And pioneering kind of tephra investigations were kind of undertaken by Mashida and Arai in the 80s. And they've produced this amazing atlas of tephra in and around Japan, collating all of the outcrops with the new road constructions and infrastructure being built. And lots of these outcrops today are concreted, sprayed with concrete on some of the road outcrops because they're quite unstable. So this is a really amazing resource that they put together. Yeah, it's a great starting point to kind of track some of these large caldera and really large magnitude events. So if I point out Kikai here, which is a volcanic island caldera, you can see that the KTZ, which was a huge eruption, kind of blankets that whole area. So these are all visible kind of in the outcrops. But only kind of the major markers are kind of well tracked or adequately characterized, and almost none have geochemical data, glass data, that mean that you can kind of check the correlations and also compare the compositions through time. So work that we've been doing across Japan is visiting some of these outcrops and trying to create geochemical fingerprints for different centers, and sequentially going through these outcrops and trying to get pumice and ash and analyze these to kind of build compositional fields. So here's an outcrop in Hokkaido, down northern Honshu in Towada, and down in Aso as well. So yeah, we typically visit these outcrops and just take sequential deposits and representative samples to try and get the full compositional range of these eruptive products. And now we're in a position to kind of generate fingerprints for these different centers and also the different eruptions. So here's just a biplot of the silica and the potassium for different volcanoes on different arcs. And you can see that you can quite easily discriminate between the arcs and kind of then plot on your distal tephra. So these are all Suigetsu visible layers, plotting on the fields. So you can kind of pull them apart using majors and trace elements. And the trace elements are really good to pull apart some of the eruption events from the same volcano. So kind of reassessing the data that we had and using trace elements. So here's a nice plot to show using the yttrium that kind of the lower yttrium amounts are typical of Dyson and Sanbei volcanoes, very different to those from the Kyushu arc, for example. And you can use the chronology and to kind of pull apart very closely spaced in time eruption events. So you can see we already have an amazing error on these, like plus or minus 80 at 2 sigma uncertainty. But also with the resolution of Suigetsu, you can also pull apart events that are really closely spaced in time. So you can see 6 years between explosive large events. So one of the case studies I wanted to flag was one of the youngest visible layers that we have in the Suigetsu core. The tephra is known as the BTM, and this originates from Shangbai volcano, which is a caldera on the border of China and North Korea. The border goes directly through the lake. And this is also widely known as the Millennium Eruption. So this was a really large eruption that caused the formation of the caldera, which is now formed by the lake itself. And yeah, one of the largest eruptions in the Common Era. So VEI 7. And it's a really valuable widespread layer, particularly in the north of Japan. And it's erupted quite close to the onset of the medieval warm period, so it's quite interesting high point to try and compare climate records around that time. And I just wanted to flag that the composition of this eruption, so it's quite different from those because it's on the back arc to those on Japan. And also the eruption had 2 phases, so an early phase of a kommanditic, so more high silica component, and a later a phase of a trichytic component, which plots over here. So ash from this eruption has been found in the Greenland ice cores in this paper, and but actually the best age for this event is generated by a tree ring wiggle matched age, and that is dated to 946 AD. And they were able to do this because there's a Miyake cosmogenic event preserved in the tree ring at 775, so they could count perfectly back from that anomaly. And what's really nice for us is that we can import the age of that eruption into our Bayesian age model, which you can kind of see an example of here. So that takes the uncertainty at this portion right in unconstrained, and helps date some of the other tephras that are situated above and below. And there are a couple very close in time. And as you can see here, as part of this paper, we also tracked the different distributions of the kommanditic and the trachytic phase. And you can see that it's quite a variable kind of dispersal of these events. So you can see down at Lake Suigetsu, which is quite outside the known dispersal, was mainly kommanditic. And building on from this, it's allowed assessments of, now that the age is constrained and we have a better understanding of the dispersal, it's allowed reinterpretations of possible historical observations of this event. So, for example, because it's found at Suigetsu, there was a reassessment of some of the historical records from Nara, which is not too far away. And in that year, in November, there's descriptions of white ash falling like snow. And more recently, we've using these distal deposits, thicknesses, and different phases of the trachyte and the commandite. Antonio Costa has also been able to model atmospheric dispersal using 4-3D, a really smart way of kind of using a dual step inversion to kind of model the different phases of this eruption, and kind of estimate some of the eruption parameters for the event. And you can see those here, so plumes more than 30 kilometers in altitude to kind of replicate what we're seeing in the distal realm. And as I mentioned, he's able, and the group's able to model the dispersal of the kommanditic and the trachytic phase separately because of these occurrences. So as well as visible ash layers within the core, we're also really interested in looking for non-visible ash layers. And so these are termed cryptotephras and typically contain lower concentrations of ash diluted in the sediment, so it's not possible to kind of see a discrete horizon. So to identify their stratigraphic position, we need to search through the core contiguously to try and find peaks in the volcanic glass that will replicate a primary ashfall event. And actually, some of these layers can be more valuable than visible layers because you can pick up eruptions that possibly were lower magnitude, or even from more distal locations, so kind of extending that dispersal footprint and the records that you can kind of integrate within your tephrastratigraphy. And I hope this isn't too juddery and it's going to stream okay, but it's just a quick video to show the kind of process that we use. So as I mentioned, sampling continuously through the core. You can then dry your sediment sample so that you can work out how many glass shards there are per gram. We typically sieve the sample for Suigetsu just with a 50 micron mesh. And then we can use heavy liquid, so we use SPT at set densities that we know we can pull off unwanted material like light organics, and then we'll float off at the density of volcanic glass so that we can kind of create this kind of pure fraction to count the glass shard compositions preserved at each point through the core. So then we can just mount those on slides and count exactly how many glass shards are in each kind of resolution of your sample. And we can use the morphology of the glass and also the composition to kind of work out primary events as well, and kind of characteristics based on that. So this was the bulk of my PhD work. So I'm just showing here the visible tephrastratigraphy again, marked on the core. So firstly, in the Holocene, searching for non-visible layers. So I've marked those on with the dotted lines. And what we can do is kind of handpick out those glass shards and use the compositional data set that I mentioned before to kind of pinpoint the volcanic centers and, where possible, known eruptions using these fields. And I've just marked on here in orange where some of these cryptotephras are originating from. So it's not surprising that upwind you're getting eruptions preserved in Lake Suigetsu, but what the cryptotephra work is really allowing us to do is integrate eruptions from all across Japan. So, for example, from Mashu, I think it's over 1,000 kilometers away, and Tawada and other parts of the arcs. So in this time period, we're picking up 13 different volcanic sources, integrating eruptions from across the arcs, and we can start to pull apart repose intervals for some of the volcanoes that we had very little or poor understanding of their eruptive history. We can start to look at repose rates and mapping the ash fallout and so on. So here we just plotted some of the key environmental records and where some of these key eruptions can be found, and start to try and build up a framework to kind of identify where tephras might be in other records and other marine cores, for example. And then moving into MIS3, so between 30 to 50,000, again, we see quite a similar story. So again, using the compositions to try and work out where they're from. And then again here in orange, also kind of similar sources, kind of picking up eruptions from Fuji as well. So of these layers, here's a figure showing kind of splitting them into their different volcanic sources. And you can see that you get these clusters of activity. And at the very top of this sequence is the AT 30 centimeter thick caldera forming event. And what's quite interesting is that you can see several explosive events of Ira and Aso building up to this big eruption. And something else that we pick up is that other kind of more distal sources like Shangbaishang and Yolundo, which is an island in South Korea, clearly have the potential and have had produced large eruptions that do blanket Japan numerous times through this period. And as a case study, really looking at Aso, we see 10 eruptions during this period, and it's quite interesting because they erupt very different, diverse magmas through time, kind of along this trend here. And we can use the chronology to kind of pick up how these sit. So you can see here, this is plotted by age, and as I mentioned, kind of a build up to this caldera forming event. And proximally, these are some scans from some of the outcrops we visited last year from Aso. You can see these are really detailed proximal records, but it's very difficult to kind of pick up or like constrain the chronology. And actually from the distal realm, we're able to see which of these events actually have the potential and are widespread events impacting Japan and other populated regions. So although Aso was known to be very active during this period, there are no other distal ash equivalents. Suigetsu kind of has so far provided the only good chronology and evidence of their dispersal. And yeah, we can pick up kind of different phases of activity with age uncertainties around 80 years. And just to kind of flag another kind of nice example of using these tephras. So the Suigetsu sediments also preserve the paleomagnetic Le Champ excursion really amazingly well, and also kind of show these fine structures and potentially a post Le Champ excursion as well. And we find 2 tephras kind of capping this early stage, which is quite nice, so that hopefully we can use these layers and other records to kind of pin down some of these details and have a look at the regional expression of this. So in general, we see about 4 times as many cryptotephra layers than visible markers through the core. And there are at least 66 markers, and this is going to be considerably extended with Sophie's work in the period between 50 to 100,000 years, and also work that we've now completed in the deeper sections. And in general, yes, we see ash more widely than previously anticipated against known predominant plume dispersals, which is estimated from the proximal deposits, and many previously undocumented eruptions. And from a hazard perspective, I've just plotted here the persons per kilometre squared up on the map, and also some of the nuclear power plants, just to kind of demonstrate this. But we typically see ashfall events reaching central Honshu about once every 5,000 years. And we estimate that these must have been at least VEI 4 or 5 events to be recorded as cryptotephra layers in Suigetsu, considering the amount of fine ash generation that would have to occur and the concentrations that we see. And quite obviously, we see clusters in time of pulses of activity, and also periods that do not preserve any ash fall at all. And we're kind of working on pulling all of this together once we have the complete record. And one other case study I wanted to highlight was some work that we've been doing with the XRF data to kind of test whether we can pull any of these cryptotephra layers out by using different compositions and tracking those through the core. Yeah, we checked the responses across all the 10 visibles and the section of the cryptotephra. And we kind of found that only 10% of the cryptotephra could be robustly located with peaks using in the XRF data. And that means that all the lab work was really worth it, which I was kind of happy about. But this is because we think caused by just the composition of the host sediment, and actually that the cryptotephra vary considerably in their concentration, their composition, their grain size, and it's just too variable to kind of create some kind of caps on those things. So even tephras from the same center with similar and concentration sometimes would show really obviously in the XRF and sometimes wouldn't. But here's a nice example of where it works really obviously. So we can kind of really pin down the position of the cryptotephra layer in the core. So that's really nice. And here's another example of where we have a nice, a big, thick, visible layer within the core, the KAH tephra. And although you can't see that the concentration of glass shards in the core cryptically, we know they're very high concentrations through this stage. And what you can do is use the XRF data to track the tail off of the glass shards as they're no longer being remobilized and reworked in the regional environment. And you can kind of pick up these cryptic event layers in the core, and kind of pick up, you can pick up some cryptotephra within periods of high concentrations. And although I couldn't pick this particular tephra layer up by a peak in glass shards, it was more based on the morphology change. So it was quite nice to also see there is some kind of signal, but as you can tell, there are many of these low magnitude signals because the lake is so sensitive, and you'd end up testing too many of these peaks to kind of find layers like this. And of course there is glass all the way through this section, so you have to kind of have some kind of context on that. And I think, yeah, and this example again with the tail off and then a clear reworking event that's remobilized the glass, so it's quite interesting. And we're also now starting to look at the thin sections and try and pick out some of the positions of these cryptotephras as well. So here's a nice example of an older eruption from Shangbaishang. And you can see here that the thin section has cracked. So this crack here, because the tephra kind of is in this position, and yeah, it's just cracked along the tephra basically, but you can see the glass shards quite nicely. And yeah, we were quite shocked to see how nicely and stratigraphically constrained the glass shards were, so around 200 microns. So this is something we're pursuing further to kind of look at the seasonality of the deposition of some of these events. So to kind of sum up a bit, the tephra record, the visible layers and the cryptotephra layers, has really improved our understanding on the timing of the eruptions in this region, the frequency and the dispersal and the size, magnitude of some of these events. And the information has been essential to kind of understand the activity and their life cycle through time. And they have a lot of uses in paleoenvironmental research once more of these records are kind of found and identified, and they can of course provide brilliant chronological constraints when they're found in other records as well. And the insight, I guess, is really only possible because of the excellent resolution and the Varve chronology that underpins all of this work. And I thought I'd finish showing you some pictures from the Varve Museum in Japan, because there's probably no better place to show these. Yeah, so if you do get the chance to visit, it's an incredible museum. Yeah, the core sections span the length, so you can kind of travel through time looking at the different tephras and earthquakes, and yeah, it's pretty amazing. And of course they have some amazing Varve themed snacks, sandwiches and ties and things, so yeah, it can make you bankrupt. And also in the cafe, they have these amazing Varves sandwiches that have a straw going through them with a drilling rig, so you can take your own core. And this was most recently the 5 lakes of Mikata, and this one's the Suigetsu drink, so of course you have to pick that one. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there to allow time for some questions. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.